My hands were shaking as I held the envelope from the insurance company. Not from age, I'm 67, and my hands are generally steady, but from the kind of tremor that comes when you're holding a number so large it doesn't quite fit into your understanding of reality. $33 million. That's what the envelope said. $33 million. Life insurance. My wife Catherine's life insurance policy. The policy she had taken out 15 years ago, back when we first got married, back when she was young and healthy, and had no idea that a delivery truck would run a red light and change everything in the span of 3 seconds. Catherine had been hit by that truck 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. The funeral was 6 weeks ago. And I had spent the last week trying to process the fact that she was gone, while simultaneously trying to understand what I was supposed to do with $33 million. I had been an accountant for 43 years. I had worked for a firm in Denver. I had been comfortable, more than comfortable, but not wealthy. Not by this measure. This kind of money belonged to people in movies, to people on television, to people who lived lives that were so far removed from my own that I couldn't even imagine what it would feel like to have that much security. The thing is, Catherine and I didn't need the money. Not really. We had retirement savings. We had a home that was paid off. We had Social Security coming to us. We had enough. We had more than enough. And now suddenly we had this enormous, unwieldy, impossible amount of money that was meant to be a replacement for a person I loved and couldn't replace. As if money could ever be equivalent to Catherine's presence, to her laugh, to the way she would hold my hand while we watched television in the evening, to the sound of her voice saying my name. I sat in my study, in the leather chair that had been my refuge for the past 7 weeks, and I looked at that number. $33 million. The house was quiet, too quiet. Catherine had always liked to have music playing in the background. She would turn on classical music or jazz, and it would fill the spaces between us, giving the silence a texture, a shape. Without that music, without Catherine moving through the rooms, the house felt hollow. It felt like a shell of something that used to be alive. I thought about calling my son, Michael. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and their 2 children. We talk on the phone maybe once a month. He had come to the funeral. He had stood next to me during the service and had put his arm around my shoulder while the minister talked about Catherine's generous spirit and her warmth and all the ways she had touched people's lives. After the funeral, Michael had asked if I was going to be okay. I had said yes, I would be fine, and he had seemed relieved to have a clear answer, a way to categorize his worry and move on with his own life. I hadn't told him about the insurance money yet. I wasn't sure how to. The inheritance felt like something obscene to discuss, like it was somehow inappropriate to talk about Catherine's death as a financial transaction. But of course that's what it was, in some fundamental way. Catherine's death had been converted into currency. Her absence had been valued at $33 million. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat in bed, in the bed that Catherine and I had shared for 15 years, and I thought about the early days of our relationship. Catherine was my second wife. I had been married before, to a woman named Margaret. That marriage had lasted 22 years and had produced Michael and nothing else of lasting value. When Margaret and I divorced, when I was in my early 50s, I thought that was it for me. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, and I had made peace with that. I had created a comfortable solitude. I had my work, I had my routines, I had my morning coffee and my evening walks and my Sunday crossword puzzles. And then I met Catherine. She was a librarian. She was 14 years younger than me. She was smart and kind, and she laughed easily, and she seemed to see something in me that I didn't see in myself. When she agreed to have dinner with me, I was shocked. When she agreed to a second dinner, I was astonished. When she agreed to marry me, I felt like I had been given a second chance at life, a gift I hadn't asked for and didn't think I deserved. We had 15 good years together. 15 years of travel and conversation and the kind of companionship that doesn't require constant entertainment or stimulation. We were comfortable together. We had built a life, and then she was hit by a delivery truck, and everything ended. The next morning I called my lawyer. His name is Robert Chen, and he had handled my divorce settlement years ago and had done some estate planning for Catherine and me. I asked him to come to my house. I told him I needed to understand what I was supposed to do with the inheritance. I needed to understand the legal implications, the tax situation, the practical reality of what it meant to suddenly have this much money. Robert came by that afternoon. He was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, and he looked the way lawyers always look, carefully neutral, ready to manage whatever emotional situation might arise. We sat in my study, the same study where I had been staring at that insurance check all morning, and Robert laid out the details. The money was essentially mine to do with as I pleased. There were no restrictions on it. Catherine's will was simple. Everything came to me, her husband. There were no children from our marriage, no complications, no competing claims. The money was clear and available and completely mine. Robert asked me what I wanted to do with it. I told him I didn't know. I told him I needed time to think. After Robert left, I sat with the reality of what this meant. $33 million. I could retire immediately. I could travel. I could buy a larger house, though I didn't particularly want one. I could do anything. The freedom was disorienting. The possibility was overwhelming. It was 3 days after that meeting with Robert that the police came to my door. I remember it was a Tuesday afternoon. I had been sitting in the yard, just sitting in a lawn chair, looking at the garden that Catherine had planted when we moved into this house. She had spent weeks planning it, sketching out where different plants would go, what would bloom in spring versus summer versus fall. Now those plants were growing without her. The flowers were blooming without her guidance. The garden was thriving in her absence. I found something both beautiful and painful about that. There was a knock on my door. I didn't immediately get up. I was tired. I had been tired since Catherine died. It was the kind of tiredness that sleep didn't fix, the kind that came from grief, from the weight of carrying on when you didn't particularly want to. But I did get up. I did answer the door. And standing there were 2 police officers, a man and a woman. They both looked serious. The man spoke first. He said, "Are you Edward Harrison?" I said, "Yes." He said, "We need to talk to you about a matter related to your wife." My stomach dropped. I had a moment of panic. Had there been something wrong with the accident investigation? Had something come to light? Some negligence on the part of the delivery truck driver that I didn't know about? Some detail that changed what had happened? I invited them in. We sat in the living room. The police officers exchanged a look, the kind of look that suggests they have delivered bad news before and know how to navigate the emotional landscape of it. The female officer spoke this time. She said, "Mr. Harrison, we're here about a matter of identity verification. We've received a report from someone claiming to be your wife's first husband. He says that he has been trying to contact your wife for some time and that he's only now learning of her death." I didn't understand. I said something like, "Catherine's first husband? But he's been dead for 30 years. The officers exchanged another look. The male officer pulled out a photograph. He showed it to me. The photograph was of a man, probably around my age, maybe a few years older. He was wearing a casual shirt. He looked tired but alive. He looked real. "This is the man who came to us," the officer said. "He claims his name is James Morrison. He claims he was married to Catherine Morrison in 1989. He claims they divorced in 1993. He claims that Catherine told people he was dead, and he would like to know why." I felt something strange happening in my chest, a tightness, a sensation like the ground was shifting. I said, "That's not possible. Catherine told me her first husband died in a car accident. It was one of the defining traumas of her life. She never got over it." The officers exchanged yet another look. The female officer said, "Mr. Harrison, this man is very much alive, and he's hired a lawyer. He's demanding to know why your wife told people he was dead. He's also asking questions about any assets that might have belonged to Catherine from their marriage." I felt my hands begin to shake. I felt something like anger, but it was mixed with confusion, with betrayal, with the strange sensation of having the ground beneath my reality shift. Catherine had lied to me. Catherine had told me that her first husband was dead, that she had mourned him, that she had spent years recovering from that loss. And it was a lie. He was alive. He was out there. He was demanding answers. The officers left me their card. They said they would be in touch. They said that the man, James Morrison, had not made any formal accusations yet, but that he was pursuing legal action to understand what had happened to his marriage, why he had been told to stay away from Catherine, and whether there were any financial matters related to their union that he was entitled to. After they left, I sat in the silence of my house, and I tried to process what I had just learned. The woman I had loved and married, the woman who had died 7 weeks ago, had lied to me about something fundamental. She had created an entire false narrative about her past, and now that she was gone, that lie was unraveling and I was being forced to confront it. I called my lawyer. I told him what had happened. He said he would need to do some research. He said that if this man was claiming some kind of legal connection to Catherine, if he was making claims on her estate or on my inheritance, then we would need to understand what his legal standing actually was. That night I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed in the dark and I thought about Catherine. I thought about the woman I thought I knew. I thought about how a person can live with someone for 15 years and still not truly know them. I thought about all the conversations where she had mentioned her dead first husband, all the ways that tragedy had been woven into her identity, into the way she presented herself to the world. I thought about how that narrative had made me sympathetic to her, had made me feel protective, had made me feel like I was rescuing her from her grief. And it was all a lie. The next morning, I did something I had been avoiding. I went through Catherine's things. Not her clothes, I wasn't ready for that yet, but her personal papers, her documents, her files. I looked for anything that might explain what had really happened in her first marriage. In a box in the back of her closet, I found letters, actual physical letters written by hand from someone named James. The letters dated back to 1994, a year after Catherine said she had divorced him. In the letters, he was asking her why she wouldn't respond to his calls. He was asking her why she had told people he was dead. He was asking her repeatedly to please contact him, to please tell him what he had done wrong, to please give him some kind of explanation for why she had decided to pretend he no longer existed. Reading those letters, I felt something shift inside me. Yes, Catherine had lied to me. Yes, she had created a false narrative. But as I read James's words, I began to sense that there was more to this story than simple deception. James seemed confused. He seemed hurt. He seemed to be reaching out from a place of genuine pain, trying to understand why the woman he had loved had decided to erase him from existence. I found an address in one of the letters, an old address from the 1990s, but it was something. I gave it to my lawyer and asked him to do some digging. I asked him to find out who this James Morrison was, what had really happened between him and Catherine, and what his legal claims might be. 2 days later, Robert called me back. He said he had some information. He said that James Morrison was a real person. He said that James had indeed been married to Catherine from 1989 to 1993. He said that the marriage had ended in a divorce, not in James's death. He said that shortly after the divorce, Catherine had moved to Colorado, changed her name back to her maiden name, Catherine Wells, and had essentially disappeared from James's life. Robert also told me something else. He said that Catherine's first marriage had been cut short by a tragic event, not James's death, but something else, something that had happened in 1992, just before they divorced. Robert wouldn't tell me what it was over the phone. He asked if I could come to his office. When I arrived at Robert's office the next morning, he closed the door, and he told me something that made me understand, finally, why Catherine had done what she had done, why she had lied, why she had created this elaborate fiction about her past. James and Catherine had a child together, a daughter. The daughter's name was Emma, and she had been born in 1990. But in 1992, when Emma was 2 years old, she had died. She had gotten sick. It was some kind of infection, something that could have been prevented or treated. And by the time Catherine and James realized how serious it was too late. Emma had died in the hospital, and Catherine and James's marriage had never recovered from the trauma. They had divorced a year later, both of them unable to carry the weight of their shared grief. And then Catherine had done something that, in a strange way, I could now understand. She had decided to bury that entire chapter of her life. She had changed her name. She had moved away. And she had told people that her first husband was dead because, in a way, she felt like he should be. She felt like that version of her life, the version where she had been married and had had a child and had experienced that devastating loss, should be dead. She wanted to start over. She wanted to create a new identity, a new narrative, a new life that didn't include the trauma of Emma's death. When I heard this, when I understood what had really happened, my anger transformed into something else. It transformed into sorrow, into compassion, into a strange kind of understanding that didn't excuse the lie, but made it comprehensible. Catherine hadn't lied to me because she was a bad person. She had lied to me because she was broken, and she was trying to create a life where that brokenness wouldn't define her. But the problem is that you can't actually create a new life by erasing the old one. You can't bury your past so completely that it doesn't have consequences. The past always finds you. It always comes back. And sometimes, like in this case, it comes back at your door with a lawyer and a list of questions. I called James Morrison. My lawyer had given me his number. When he answered, his voice was cautious, confused. He didn't know who I was. I told him my name. I told him I was Catherine's husband. I told him that Catherine had passed away. I told him that I had just learned the truth about their marriage and about Emma, and I wanted to understand what he wanted. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When James finally spoke, his voice was different. It was sad. He said, "I just wanted her to talk to me. I just wanted her to tell me what I did wrong. I've spent 30 years wondering what I did that was so terrible that she decided I was dead." I asked him to come to my house. I told him I thought we needed to talk in person. I told him that there were things we needed to discuss about Catherine, about her will, about the inheritance, and about what had really happened between them. He hesitated, then agreed. When James arrived at my house 3 days later, I saw in his face a man who had spent 3 decades carrying a wound that he didn't fully understand. He was older than me. He was probably in his early 70s. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had learned to live with pain, but had never fully healed from it. We sat in my study, the same study where I had stared at the insurance check, where I had met with the police officers, where my understanding of Catherine had been completely reconstructed, and I told James everything I had learned. I told him about Emma. I told him about Catherine's decision to erase her past. I told him that Catherine had lied to me, but that I now understood why she had lied. James cried. He sat in that leather chair and he cried, and I realized that no one had ever told him the truth before. No one had ever explained to him that Catherine's decision to erase him wasn't a judgment on him as a person. It was a reflection of her own trauma, her own inability to carry the weight of their shared grief. I made a decision in that moment. I made a decision that would surprise my lawyer and would confuse my son, but that felt necessary, felt right, felt like the only way to honor what Catherine should have done while she was still alive. I offered James a settlement. I offered him a portion of the inheritance. I explained that Catherine had left this money behind, that she was now gone, and that in some way James deserved to understand what had happened to her, deserved to know that her decision to erase him had never been about him. It had always been about her own brokenness. James initially refused. He said he didn't want money. He said he just wanted answers. But I persisted. I told him that Catherine should have given him those answers while she was alive. Since she hadn't, I would give them to him now, and I would give him money as well, as a way of acknowledging the harm that her lie had caused, even though that harm was born out of pain rather than malice. Eventually, James accepted. We worked with lawyers to structure a settlement that felt appropriate. I gave him a significant portion of the inheritance, enough that he would have financial security for the rest of his life. In return, he agreed to not pursue any legal action against Catherine's estate, and more importantly, he agreed to share his memories of Catherine with me, the real Catherine, the Catherine who had loved him and had borne a child with him, and had experienced devastating loss. Through my conversations with James over the following weeks, I learned things about Catherine that she had never told me. I learned about the early years of her marriage, when she and James had been happy, when they had been young and full of hope. I learned about Emma. I learned about who my wife had been before she became the woman I had married. I learned about the pain that had shaped her, the decisions that had been born out of that pain, and the way that pain can make people do things that seem inexplicable until you understand the context. James and I became something like friends. He would come to my house, and we would drink coffee in my study, and we would talk about Catherine. We would share stories about her. We would try to piece together who she really was, not the version of herself that she had presented to the world, but the full, complicated, broken, beautiful woman who existed beneath all the narratives and all the lies. And through those conversations, through getting to know James, through learning the truths about Catherine's past, I began to understand something important. I began to understand that the woman I had loved was real. The intimacy we had shared was real. The 15 years we had spent together had mattered, but she had also been incomplete. She had been missing a crucial part of her own story because she had decided that part was too painful to carry. I thought about the inheritance often during this period. $33 million, money that had been born out of Catherine's death, that was meant to compensate for her absence. But what I was discovering was that no amount of money could compensate for the loss of understanding, for the loss of truth, for the loss of knowing who the person you loved really was. I made another decision. I decided to use part of the inheritance to create something. I worked with James, and we created a memorial foundation in Emma's name. The foundation provides support to families who have experienced the loss of a child. It provides counseling, financial assistance, community support, all the things that Catherine and James hadn't had access to when Emma died. In establishing this foundation, in creating something that would honor not just Catherine's daughter, but also the grief that had shaped Catherine's entire life, I felt like I was finally doing something that mattered. I felt like I was taking the blood money, the insurance proceeds that had come from Catherine's death, and transforming it into something meaningful. But this reckoning with Catherine's past, this discovery of her lie, and the pain that had motivated it, forced me to confront something in myself as well. It forced me to acknowledge that I had loved Catherine partially because of her tragedy. I had been attracted to the narrative of her grief. I had felt noble, protective, like I was saving her from her pain. And in some way, I had never pushed her to be fully authentic with me. I had been comfortable with the version of herself she presented, because that version made sense to me, because it made me feel needed. If Catherine had told me the truth, if she had told me about James, about Emma, about her decision to bury her past, would I have judged her? Would I have rejected her? I like to think I wouldn't have, but the truth is, I don't know. And Catherine never gave me the chance to find out. She decided unilaterally that those parts of her story were too dangerous to share. 7 weeks after Catherine died, almost 2 months to the day, I stood in my study and I looked at the framed photograph of Catherine on my desk. It had been taken during our wedding. She was smiling at the camera and she looked happy. She looked like a woman who had found peace. But I now knew that the peace she had found was built on a foundation of lies. I now knew that underneath that smile was a woman who had never fully recovered from the loss of her daughter, who had created an entire false history to escape from her grief, who had spent 30 years telling a man that he was dead, when really it was her past that she was trying to kill. I picked up the photograph, and I held it in my hands, and I cried. I cried for Catherine. I cried for James. I cried for Emma, the granddaughter I had never known. I cried for all the ways that pain had rippled through these people's lives, creating waves of consequence that were still being felt decades later. I cried for the version of Catherine I had loved, even though I now understood that version was incomplete, and I cried for the possibility of what Catherine's life could have been if she had found the courage to be honest with herself and with the people who loved her. This is what I have learned from inheriting $33 million and from discovering that the woman who left me that money had lied to me about something fundamental. Money can't buy happiness. It can't buy authenticity. It can't buy the kind of peace that comes from living an honest life. And it certainly can't replace the people we lose or repair the damage that's been done by lies, even when those lies are born out of pain. What I have learned is that family secrets have a way of surfacing. What I have learned is that the past always catches up with us. What I have learned is that the people we love are always more complicated than we think, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to accept them in all their complexity, to forgive them for their lies, to try to understand the pain that motivated those lies, and to use whatever power we have, whether that's money or influence, or simply the ability to listen, to help repair the damage that has been done. James still comes to my house sometimes. We drink coffee and we talk about Catherine. We talk about Emma. We talk about the foundation we created in her name. And sometimes on quiet afternoons, I find myself grateful for James's presence. I find myself grateful that Catherine's lie has been exposed, because that exposure has given me access to a fuller, more honest understanding of who my wife really was. It has given me the opportunity to know a part of her history that she tried to bury. It has given me the chance to honor the people she loved and the pain she carried. The inheritance sits in accounts. I haven't spent much of it. I don't particularly want to. What I wanted was Catherine. What I wanted was to know her fully. What I wanted was to have the conversation that Catherine and I never had, where she could have told me the truth, and I could have accepted her as she really was. But that conversation will never happen now. So instead, I have these conversations with James. And in some way, through James, through his memories and his pain, and his willingness to share his story, I feel like I'm finally getting to know the woman I married. That is perhaps the greatest gift that James has given me. Not the closure, because there is no real closure to something like this, but the opportunity to see Catherine through someone else's eyes. To see her not as the woman who became my wife, but as a young woman who loved deeply, who suffered profoundly, who made choices that rippled through decades of other people's lives, and to accept that she was human. She was flawed. She was broken. And despite all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, she was worthy of love. The weeks that followed my first meeting with James were some of the most psychologically complex of my life. Not because of the money. The $33 million had become almost abstract, a number that represented something I didn't fully understand, but because of the questions, endless questions, questions about Catherine, questions about who I had married, questions about what it meant to build a life with someone and realize, after their death, that you had never actually known them. I started doing research. I called Catherine's former colleagues from her library job in Colorado, the one she had held before we met. I spoke with people who had known her back then, people who had worked alongside her for years. I asked them about Catherine. I asked them what she had been like. I asked them if they had known anything about her past, anything about her having been married before, anything about her daughter. Most people remembered her as quiet, professional, kind, someone who kept to herself, someone who was excellent at her job but who didn't socialize much outside of work. No one mentioned a dead husband. No one mentioned a tragedy. No one mentioned Emma. Catherine had created such a complete separation between her past and her present that no one in her life in Colorado seemed to know that she had ever been anyone other than who she presented herself to be. I also contacted Catherine's mother. I hadn't spoken to her much during Catherine's life. They had a complicated relationship, and Catherine had preferred to keep distance from her family. But now, with Catherine gone, I thought perhaps Catherine's mother could tell me something. Perhaps she could explain why Catherine had felt the need to lie so completely. When I called her, Catherine's mother seemed surprised to hear from me. We had met only a handful of times. Our conversations had always been polite but distant. Now, when I asked her about Catherine's first marriage, about Emma, about the decision to erase that part of her life, Catherine's mother went silent for a long time. Finally, she said something that added another layer to the story. She said that Catherine's decision to pretend her first husband was dead had actually started with Catherine's family. After Emma died, after Catherine and James's marriage fell apart, Catherine had gone back to live with her parents for a while. She had been devastated. She had been barely functional. And instead of helping her process that grief, instead of supporting her through it, Catherine's family had told her to move on. They had told her that dwelling on the past would only make things worse. They had told her that she needed to stop talking about Emma, stop thinking about James, start fresh. Catherine's mother actually said this to me. We told her that it was time to let go. We told her that holding on to that pain would only destroy her future. We thought we were helping her. We thought we were protecting her from further suffering. But what we were really doing was teaching her that her pain was unwelcome, that her grief was a burden to others, that the only way to survive was to pretend that the people and experiences that had shaped her had never existed. Hearing this, I felt something shift in my understanding. Catherine hadn't created this lie in a vacuum. She had been taught to create it. She had been encouraged to bury her past by her family. And then, when she met me, she had simply continued the pattern that had been established. She had presented a version of herself that was acceptable, that didn't require anyone to carry the weight of her pain. I shared this information with James during one of our regular coffee meetings. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he said something that surprised me. He said, "I've spent 30 years angry at Catherine for lying to me. I've spent 30 years hurt by her decision to erase me. But what I'm starting to understand is that Catherine didn't have the tools to handle what happened. She didn't have the support she needed. And instead of reaching out to people who could help her, she isolated herself. Instead of letting people in, she pushed them away. That's not Catherine's fault. That's a failure of the people around her. That's a failure of her family, of the culture that taught her that grief is something to be hidden, not processed." James had become remarkably wise about Catherine's choices, and I realized that his wisdom came from his own pain, from his own decades of trying to understand why the woman he loved had decided he was dead. He had done the work of understanding Catherine in a way that I hadn't. He had processed his anger and his hurt and had arrived at a place of compassion. And in listening to him, I was beginning to arrive at that place as well. But there was still the matter of my son. Michael still didn't know the full story. He knew that Catherine had died. He had come to the funeral. He had asked if I was okay, but he didn't know about the inheritance. He didn't know about James. He didn't know that his stepmother had lied about something fundamental. And I knew that eventually he would need to know. I called Michael and asked him to come home for a weekend. I told him it was important. He heard something in my voice that made him clear his schedule, and the following Friday, he was at my door. Michael is a successful man. He's a venture capitalist. He makes decisions about money and risk and innovation every day. But when he looked at me, when he saw that I had something difficult to tell him, he reverted to being a son concerned about his father. He asked what was wrong. He asked if I was okay. He asked if something had happened that I needed to tell him about. We sat in the study, that study that had become the container for all these difficult conversations, and I told him. I told him about the insurance money. I told him about James Morrison. I told him about Catherine's first marriage. I told him about Emma. I told him about the lie that Catherine had constructed and that had only unraveled after her death. Michael's reaction was complicated. He felt betrayed, not by me, but by Catherine. He had liked Catherine. They had gotten along well. They had a respectful relationship, the kind of relationship that a son and stepmother can have when both parties are trying but also maintaining appropriate boundaries. Now, learning that Catherine had lied to his father, learning that she had created an entire false narrative about her past, he felt like he had been complicit in that lie somehow. He felt like he had benefited from a relationship that was fundamentally dishonest. But then he also felt compassion. When I told him about Emma, when I explained that Catherine had lost a child and had never been given the support she needed to process that loss, Michael's anger transformed into sadness. He asked questions about Emma. He asked questions about Catherine's pain. He asked questions about James. And then he asked the question that a person who works in finance and deals with risk management would ask. He asked, "What are you going to do with the money, Dad?" Because that seems to be the real question here. The money is the thing that's forcing you to confront all of this. And the money is the thing that's going to determine what happens next. He was right. The money was the key to everything. The money had bought my attention. The money had forced me to engage with Catherine's past in a way that I might not have otherwise. The money was the thing that had brought James to my door. And now the money was the thing that would determine what came next. I had already given James a substantial settlement. But there was still more. There was still enough money to do something significant with it, and I needed to decide what that something would be. Michael and I talked late into the night. We discussed Catherine. We discussed what the inheritance meant. We discussed the foundation that James and I had started in Emma's name. Michael asked if he could become involved in that foundation. He asked if he could help determine how the money would be used, what causes would be supported, what kind of impact the foundation could have. By the end of the weekend, Michael had decided to relocate to Denver for a few months. He was going to take a sabbatical from his venture capital firm. He was going to work with James and me to establish the foundation properly. to build it into something that could genuinely help families who had experienced child loss, who were grieving, who needed support that the culture around them was unwilling or unable to provide. This decision by Michael to become involved was significant to me. It meant that he was choosing to honor Catherine's memory, not by ignoring her lie, but by using the consequence of that lie, the inheritance, to do something meaningful. He was choosing to transform the money that had come from Catherine's death into something that could help prevent other people from experiencing the kind of isolation and pain that Catherine had endured. The foundation work began in earnest. James, Michael, and I met regularly. We brought in experts in grief counseling, in child psychology, in family dynamics. We consulted with other organizations that provided support to grieving families. We created a comprehensive program that would offer immediate financial assistance to families facing the death of a child, long-term counseling support, and community connection. The chance for grieving parents to meet with others who understood their pain because they had experienced it themselves. But in the process of establishing this foundation, in the process of doing this work, something unexpected happened. I found myself becoming closer to James. Not in a romantic way. We were two men bonded by our connection to a woman and to a child that neither of us could have saved, could have changed, could have prevented from dying. But in a deeply human way, James became a friend. He became someone I could talk to about Catherine, about grief, about the strange intersection of our lives that had been created by her death and her lie. James began to open up about his own life. He told me that after Catherine had disappeared, after she had decided to erase him from existence, he had spent years trying to understand what he had done wrong. He had gone to therapy. He had tried to move on. He had eventually married again, a different woman, someone who had never known Catherine, someone who was present in a way that Catherine couldn't be. But that marriage had also failed. James had never told his second wife about Emma. He had never told her about the first marriage. He had kept that pain locked away, and eventually, that locked-away pain had poisoned the relationship. I did the same thing Catherine did, James told me. I decided that the only way to survive was to pretend the past didn't exist. But pretending doesn't work. The past is always there, always pressing against you, always demanding to be acknowledged. I just didn't know how to acknowledge it without being destroyed by it. James's realization became the catalyst for a shift in how we approached the foundation. We decided that the foundation wouldn't just provide financial support. It would also create space for people to talk about their grief, to process their loss, to acknowledge the children they had lost without being told to move on, without being encouraged to forget. We would create a culture within the foundation that said grief is valid, that said loss is real, that said the children we have lost matter. They mattered, and they will always matter. About 4 months into the foundation work, I received a call from my lawyer. There was a complication. The call wasn't unexpected. I had been half expecting something like this to arise, but it was still disturbing when it happened. James's second wife, the woman he had married after Catherine, had learned about the settlement I had given him. She had learned that he had received millions of dollars from Catherine's estate, and she was contesting their divorce settlement. She was claiming that the money James received from Catherine belonged partially to her, that it was marital property, that she deserved a portion of it. When I heard this, when I realized that the inheritance was becoming complicated, that there were going to be legal battles, that money was going to draw out the worst in people, I felt something like despair. I had hoped that by establishing the foundation, by using the money to do something good, I could somehow transform the poison that the inheritance represented into something clean, something pure, something that honored Catherine's memory. But money has a way of corrupting things. Money draws out greed. Money draws out anger. Money creates complications where none existed before. And now, instead of the simple act of using Catherine's life insurance to create something meaningful, we were going to have to navigate complex legal battles about who was entitled to what. I met with my lawyer to discuss options. He suggested that the simplest thing would be to settle with the second wife, to give her a portion of the money and move on. But I felt resistant to that. I felt like giving in to her claim would be rewarding her for finding a legal technicality. It would be saying that money matters more than principle. It would be corrupting the foundation that James and Michael and I had been building. So instead, I made a different decision. I consulted with James. I told him that I would cover any settlement costs that came from this legal battle. I told him that I would not allow this money to be taken from the foundation. I told him that the money Catherine had left me was meant to do good, and it was going to do good, regardless of what legal obstacles arose. James was initially resistant to this. He felt like he shouldn't accept more help from me, like he should fight his own battles. But I explained to him that this wasn't about him. This was about honoring Catherine's memory. This was about ensuring that the money she had left behind was used in the way that she should have intended, not just as compensation for loss, but as a tool for transformation, for healing, for creating change. The legal battles lasted for several months. They were complicated and emotionally draining and ultimately successful. My lawyer argued that the settlement I had given James was based on his legal claim as a former spouse and victim of Catherine's deception. It was not marital property from his second marriage. It was compensation for a unique set of circumstances. The court agreed. James's second wife was not entitled to any portion of the settlement, but winning the legal battle didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a necessary step in a process that was bigger than any of us. It felt like clearing away obstacles so that the real work could continue. By the time the legal issues were resolved, the foundation had been operational for 6 months. We had already helped 47 families. We had already provided financial assistance to parents who were struggling to afford funeral costs, grief counseling, or simply the costs of living while they were too devastated to work. We had created support groups where grieving parents could come together and share their experiences, their pain, their memories of the children they had lost. And we were getting stories. We were getting letters from families telling us that our foundation had saved their lives. Not in a literal sense, but in a deeper sense. We had given them permission to grieve. We had given them community. We had given them acknowledgement that their pain mattered, that their children mattered, that loss is real and valid and worthy of support. One letter in particular moved me deeply. It was from a mother named Sarah, who had lost her son to cancer when the boy was 7 years old. She wrote about how her family had encouraged her to move on, how she had felt pressure to get over her grief, how she had internalized the message that dwelling on her loss was unhealthy. She wrote about how our foundation had changed that for her, how we had given her permission to continue loving her son despite his death, how we had created a space where talking about him wasn't seen as pathological, but as healthy, necessary, beautiful. Reading that letter, I thought about Catherine. I thought about how different Catherine's life might have been if she had had access to a community like this, if she had had permission to grieve, if she hadn't been taught that the only way to survive was to pretend that Emma had never existed, if she had been allowed to love her daughter despite her death, to carry that love forward, to integrate that loss into her identity rather than trying to bury it. And I felt a deep sadness for Catherine. I felt grief for the life she might have lived if she had been given different tools, different support, different permission to be fully human in her pain. I shared Sarah's letter with James, and James told me something that I had never expected to hear. He said, "I forgive Catherine." I asked him what he meant. He said, "For 30 years, I've been angry at Catherine for lying to me, for telling people I was dead, for erasing me from her life. And all that anger did was keep me trapped in the past, keep me from moving forward, keep me from being able to build a real life." Somewhere along the way, while we've been doing this foundation work, while I've been hearing these stories from other grieving families, while I've been realizing how much pain Catherine must have been in to make the choices she made, I've realized that holding on to my anger doesn't punish Catherine. She's gone. My anger just punishes me. So I forgive her. I forgive her for the lie. I forgive her for the pain she caused me. And in forgiving her, I'm finally letting go of the past in a way that allows me to actually heal. Hearing James say this, I felt something release in my own heart. I realized that I had also been carrying anger toward Catherine, anger at having been lied to, anger at having been told a false narrative, anger at having loved a woman who wasn't fully honest with me. And hearing James forgive her gave me permission to forgive her as well. I thought about Catherine often during this period. I thought about the woman I had married, the woman who had been kind to me, who had loved me in her own limited way, who had built a life with me over 15 years. I thought about the woman she had been before I met her, the woman who had loved James, who had given birth to Emma, who had been devastated by loss. I thought about the fact that these were the same person, that Catherine's capacity for love and her capacity for pain were inextricably linked, that you couldn't have one without the other. And I arrived at a place of acceptance, not acceptance of the lie. I still don't think it was right for Catherine to have deceived me about her past, but acceptance of Catherine as a human being who had been broken by circumstances beyond her control, who had been shaped by pain and by a culture that taught her that pain should be hidden, who had done the best she could with the tools she had been given. About 8 months after James first came to my door, I received a call from his therapist. Wait, I should clarify. James had gone back to therapy after we reconnected. He said he wanted to process everything that had happened, everything that was happening, everything that the foundation work was stirring up in him. His therapist called me to ask if I would be willing to participate in a session. She thought it might be healing for James to have me there, to be able to talk through our relationship and what it meant. I agreed. When I went to the session, the therapist asked me why I had decided to give James money, why I had decided to work with him on the foundation, why I had essentially chosen to rebuild my life around this man who had once been married to the woman I loved. I thought about the question carefully before answering, and then I said something that I think captured the essence of what had happened. I said, when Catherine died, when I learned that she had lied to me, I had a choice. I could have decided that the lie meant that our entire relationship was false. I could have decided that I had been a fool, that Catherine had never really loved me, that everything we had built together was built on lies. But instead, I chose to see the lie as a symptom of Catherine's pain, not as evidence of her cruelty. And when James appeared at my door, I had another choice. I could have seen him as a threat, as someone coming to claim a portion of what had been left to me. But instead, I saw him as someone who had also been harmed by Catherine's pain, someone who understood her in a way that I never could, someone who could help me understand the woman I had married. In choosing to work with James, in choosing to create the foundation, in choosing to use Catherine's money to do something meaningful, I was honoring both Catherine and James. I was saying that their pain mattered. I was saying that the daughter they had lost together mattered. I was saying that love, even love that's complicated, even love that's broken, even love that's expressed through lies and deception, still matters. The therapist nodded and then she turned to James. She asked him what it had meant to him to have me make these choices, to have me believe his story, to have me work with him to honor Emma's memory. James thought for a long moment, and then he said, "It meant that someone finally saw me. It meant that someone finally understood that Catherine's lie wasn't the only version of the story. It meant that someone finally valued my experience, my pain, my right to have been part of Catherine's life, even though she had decided to erase me from it. Edward has given me back my dignity." After the therapy session, James and I went to get coffee. We sat in a cafe, and we talked about everything and nothing. We talked about Catherine. We talked about Emma. We talked about the foundation and the work we were doing. And then James said something that surprised me. He said, "I've been thinking about Catherine a lot lately, and I've realized something. Catherine's greatest flaw was also her greatest gift. Her flaw was that she couldn't integrate her past into her present. She couldn't figure out how to be the woman she had been with me and the woman she became with you. But her gift was that she pushed both of us to become better people. She pushed me to confront my own pain and to find healing. She pushed you to confront your assumptions about who you thought she was and to develop compassion for her complexity. In a strange way, Catherine has been the catalyst for both of us to become more fully human." I understood what he meant. Catherine's lie had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. It had brought James and me together. It had created the foundation. It had allowed us both to process our own pain and grief and anger. It had forced us both to confront the ways that we had been shaped by the people we loved and the secrets we kept. The weeks that followed were spent consolidating the foundation's work. Michael had decided to stay permanently in Denver. He had left his venture capital firm and had taken a job managing the business operations of the foundation. He had moved into a house. He had started dating a woman who worked as a grief counselor. He had built a life that was rooted in meaning and purpose rather than in financial gain. Watching my son make this choice, watching him decide to dedicate his life to something that had grown out of his stepmother's death and the secrets that death had revealed, I felt proud. I felt like Michael had understood something that took me a lifetime to learn, that money is only meaningful when it's used to create connection, community, and healing. 1 year after Catherine's death, we held an event to commemorate the foundation's first year of operation. We invited all the families we had worked with, all the volunteers who had contributed to the foundation, all the therapists and counselors who had lent their expertise, and we held a special ceremony to honor Emma Morrison, the daughter that Catherine and James had lost, the granddaughter I never met, the catalyst for everything that had happened. At that ceremony, James spoke. He spoke about Emma. He spoke about the grief of losing a child. He spoke about Catherine. He spoke about the journey he had been on, the 30 years of anger and confusion, and the year of healing and reconciliation that had followed. And he ended by saying, Catherine made a choice to erase me from her life, but in doing that, she taught me something important. She taught me that you can't actually erase the past. You can't actually pretend that the people and experiences that have shaped you never existed. All you can do is carry them with you, acknowledge them, honor them, and allow them to transform you into a better person. Emma will always be with me. Catherine's decision to run away from that reality didn't change that. All it did was delay the healing. And I'm grateful that I finally have the chance to do the work that Catherine couldn't do for herself. Listening to James speak, I felt tears in my eyes. I felt grief for Catherine. Grief that she hadn't lived long enough to do this work. Grief that she had spent 30 years running from pain instead of running toward healing. I felt gratitude for James's willingness to forgive, his willingness to heal, his willingness to transform his pain into something meaningful, and I felt acceptance. I accepted that Catherine had been flawed, that she had made choices that hurt people, that she had lied to me, and that those lies had consequences. But I also accepted that Catherine had been human, that she had been doing the best she could with the circumstances she had been given, that her pain had been real and valid, even though the story she had created around that pain was false. After the ceremony, after the event had concluded, after all the families and volunteers had left, I sat alone in the foundation's office, the space where we had begun this work just a year ago, and I thought about the inheritance. $33 million. Money that had meant nothing to me. Money that had confused me. Money that had seemed like a curse rather than a blessing. But that money had transformed into something meaningful. It had become a place of healing. It had become a community of grieving families supporting each other. It had become a foundation that was changing lives. I thought about what Catherine would think if she could see what had happened because of her death, because of the insurance policy she had taken out all those years ago, because of the money that had been released when she was hit by a delivery truck on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I thought about what Catherine would think of James and me working together, of the foundation bearing Emma's name, of the families we were helping, of the community we were building. And I thought about something that my therapist, yes, I had also gone back to therapy after all of this, to process my own grief and my own betrayal, had told me. She said, Catherine's legacy isn't defined by the lie she told. Catherine's legacy is defined by what happens after her death, by how the people who loved her choose to respond to the truth, by whether they choose healing or continued resentment. By that measure, Catherine's legacy is beautiful. Catherine's legacy is the foundation. Catherine's legacy is the families who are being helped, the children who are being remembered, the grief that is being honored instead of hidden. Catherine's legacy is James and me working together in forgiveness and healing. Catherine's legacy is Michael choosing meaning over money. Catherine's legacy is Emma, who died 40 years ago, but who is still being honored, still being loved, still being acknowledged as someone who mattered. And that, I have come to understand, is what happens when you inherit money that you didn't think you needed, when you discover that the person you loved lied to you, when you meet the ghost of your wife's past, when you choose forgiveness over anger, when you choose healing over resentment, you transform tragedy into meaning. You transform inheritance into legacy. You transform secrets into stories that can help other people understand their own pain. This is what I have learned. This is what Catherine's death has taught me. This is the gift that has come from her absence. Final reflections. 2 years after Catherine's death, I sit in my study, the same study where all of these difficult conversations began, and I think about what it means to truly know someone. I think about the fact that Catherine and I shared 15 years of our lives, and I never knew her past. I never knew about Emma. I never knew about the lie she had constructed. I never knew about the pain that lay beneath the surface of her kindness, her gentleness, her willingness to build a life with me. And I've come to accept that this is the human condition. We can never fully know anyone. We can never fully understand the complexity of another person's experience, the depth of their pain, the origins of their choices. All we can do is try. All we can do is listen. All we can do is remain open to the possibility that the people we love are more complicated than we think. James and I have become genuine friends. We have coffee together every week. We talk about the foundation. We talk about Catherine. We talk about Emma. We talk about our lives and our losses and our hopes. And in that friendship, I have found something that I didn't expect to find after Catherine's death. I have found healing. I have found peace. I have found a way to honor Catherine's memory without being destroyed by her lies. Michael has built a beautiful life in Denver. He and his girlfriend are talking about getting married. He has become the executive director of the foundation. He has found meaning and purpose in work that grew directly out of his father's heartbreak and his stepmother's death. He has transformed family tragedy into community healing, and the foundation continues to grow. We now serve over 300 families per year. We have expanded to other cities. We have partnerships with hospitals, with counseling centers, with schools. We are creating a culture where grief is acknowledged, where loss is honored, where the children we have lost are remembered and valued even in their absence. Catherine's legacy is no longer defined by the lie she told. Catherine's legacy is defined by the healing that has come from the truth being revealed. Catherine's legacy is the children who are being remembered, the families who are being supported, the grief that is being transformed into connection. And I have learned something that I didn't know when I first inherited $33 million. I have learned that inheritance is not just about money. Inheritance is about the stories we leave behind. Inheritance is about the impact we have on the people who survive us. Inheritance is about the choices that the people we love make in response to our death, our lies, our absence. Catherine didn't know it, but in her death, she left me with more than money. She left me with a responsibility to understand her, to honor her, to acknowledge the complexity of her human experience. She left me with James, and through James, with a deeper understanding of who Catherine had been before she became my wife. She left me with Emma, a granddaughter I never met but whose memory I have committed to honoring. She left me with a legacy of healing, and that, I have come to understand, is the greatest inheritance of all. Not money, not security, but meaning, purpose, the knowledge that in acknowledging the truth, even when that truth is painful, we create the possibility for healing, for growth, for transformation. This is what I want to say to anyone who is watching this and who might be carrying their own secrets, their own lies, their own versions of the story that they have constructed to protect themselves from pain. Know that the truth will find you. Know that the people you love will eventually discover who you really are. Know that the past cannot stay buried forever, but also know that there is mercy in that discovery. There is healing in that truth. There is redemption in allowing other people to see you fully, to know you completely, to love you not despite your pain, but because of it. Catherine made a choice to hide from her pain. That choice shaped her entire life. It defined her relationships. It created distance between her and the people who loved her. It kept her alone. And it meant that when she died, when the truth came out, it created complications and challenges and pain for the people who survived her. But I have learned that there is another choice. There is the choice to be honest. There is the choice to let people know you. There is the choice to carry your pain openly instead of hiding it. That choice is harder. That choice is scarier. That choice requires vulnerability and trust. But that choice is the only one that leads to genuine connection, to authentic relationship, to real healing. Catherine never made that choice for herself, but through the foundation, through the work that we do, through the families we help, we are honoring the choice that Catherine should have made. We are creating a world where people don't have to hide from their pain. We are creating a world where grief is acknowledged, where loss is honored, where the people we have lost are remembered and valued. And in doing that work, in honoring Catherine's memory, not despite her lies, but in a way that acknowledges and transforms those lies, we are creating something beautiful. We are creating healing. We are creating legacy. We are transforming inheritance from a number into a movement, from money into meaning, from tragedy into purpose. That is what $33 million has bought me. That is what Catherine's death has taught me. That is the gift that has come from her absence. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had lied to you? Have you ever had to reckon with the gap between who you thought someone was and who they actually were? Have you ever been forced to choose between holding on to anger and moving toward healing? I would like to hear your story.